Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Climate Confident Podcast. My name is Tom Raftery, and with me on the show today, I have my special guest, Osprey. Osprey, welcome to the podcast. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks so much for having me. I'm Osprey Orielle Lake, and I'm the founder and executive director of the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network.
Fantastic, Osprey. And why? what what got you into climate? What made this an important topic for you,
Right.
and led you to becoming director of? Give me the name again. The Women's.
It's Women's Earth and Climate Action Network, but we can go with the acronym, which is WECAN. It's a
We
lot
can.
easier to remember that. We can. And it's great to say we can. So we can.
Fantastic. So, tell me the backstory.
Well, the short version is because, of course, these kinds of endeavors, when you put your heart and soul into your life's work, they're long stories, but the short story is that I'd always been involved in environmental work. I grew up in the town of Mendocino, which is about 4 hours north of San Francisco in California on the coast. And I mention that because it's really the place I sort of did my first campaigning work to protect the ancient redwood forests, which probably a lot of people know are the tallest trees in the world. They're just absolutely magnificent. And like a lot of forests, unfortunately, greatly threatened. So I was early on engaged with why are we treating the earth in such a bad way? And what can we do about it? So fast forward quite a bit, doing all different kinds of work. It was in 2009 when in the United States, the Obama administration had come into office. And a lot of us were very hopeful that there would be a transition in how we treated the climate emergency. And at that time, the annual UN climate talks were taking place in Copenhagen.
Mhm.
And we really didn't see a drastic change in how governments were responding at the speed and scale necessary to address the crisis. And I was actually walking in the redwood forests, and I just had this deep feeling, I don't know how else to express it, of just saying, this is a all hands on deck moment. What can I do? And I started researching the best sort of nodes of intervention around the climate crisis and did not expect to learn through a lot of research that actually women are central to sustainability and climate solutions. And so that's why I started the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network, because women are so underrepresented in this space, but they have so much to offer. And also, due to gender inequality all over the world, women are impacted first and worst by the climate crisis. And I'll just give one stat to sort of ground this in a very practical way, which is there's a really powerful study that I did a lot of research on and have presented to the Scenarios Forum, which is a forum that then feeds IPCC scientists. And it states that with just a 1 unit increase in something called the Women's Political Empowerment Index, which sort of monitors women's involvement in their country and politics, social activity, their ability to grow their personal economies, just women's, you know, access and agency in a country. With just a
Mhm.
1 unit increase, we see an 11.51% decrease in carbon emissions, which, as we all know, people working in the climate space, to find something that reduces things over 10% is pretty significant.
Sure.
And I could go on with lots and lots of stats. So it's not just that it's sort of morally correct that we need gender equality and we see the importance of egalitarian societies, but it also turns out factually that you really need women at the table. And just I think something that we can also look to that I think people can grasp is, we've come out of the height of a COVID-19 pandemic,
Mhm.
but in the deep throes of it, we see that countries all over the world that were led by women did far better with their populations in navigating the COVID-19 pandemic than countries led by men. And so there's a lot to be said about women's leadership as we navigate crises. It's not about putting men down, but about lifting women up and really involving them, engaging them in world problems. And so that's how we formulated the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network, to ensure that women from the grassroots to the top levels of business and the top levels of government are being really represented.
Interesting. And explain that one to me in a little more detail. How does increasing women's representation by 1% translate into an 11% reduction in carbon emissions?
It has a lot to do with what women are doing in terms of their governance and the decisions they're making around environmental policies. and also around economy. So those two factors specifically, but it's a vast studies, but I'm just kind of giving you a little bit of the
Sure.
nuggets. It has a lot to do with governance and policy and the kind of decisions that women make and what kind of choices they're making.
Okay. Okay. Interesting. And why do you think it is that the choices that women make tend to reduce carbon emissions?
Well, first of all, I think it's really we can talk about carbon emission reductions, but I also think it's much broader than that.
Mm,
So when we're talking about climate, I think it's really good to, that was just one study that was done, but I think we can broaden the discussion to look at so many factors around s- 40 to 80% of all household food production in the global south is developed by women. And when you look at United Nations studies that look at water and water conservation and care for water in drought stricken areas, if you don't involve women in these programs to protect water, they don't work because women are the ones who are caring for the water, caring for their families, and are monitoring the water levels. So it's a vast conversation that's much broader in the sense of I think anytime you look at marginalized parts of society, you're
mhm.
going to see a lot of solutions there actually, because those are the people who are being impacted the most. So when we look at women, or we look at indigenous communities, or we look at black and brown communities, the people who are on the cutting edge of being harmed by environmental degradation or economic injustices or racial injustices or gender injustices, those are the people who are struggling. And they're
Mhm.
also the ones who then need to go look at the solutions because they're engaged in the harm, meaning that they're trying to survive and figure out how to navigate society and navigate the harms that are happening to their communities or to their populations. And so I think this has a lot to do with why, when you look at women or you look at Indigenous, Black, and Brown communities, you're seeing not just that they're being impacted first and worse, but they're also central to solutions.
Okay. So, how do we raise up the number of women being involved in politics and decision making?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? So we're all working on that. I mean, we struggle really hard on that. I would just, since we're talking about climate, one of the things that we saw, just as an example, at COP28 in Dubai, that there were 133 heads of state represented there, and
Mm,
only 15 of those 133 were women. So there's a lot of push, as an example, during the climate talks to have gender equity and more representation of women. We saw it's a big struggle because we know women are key to solutions, and people can go to my website at WECAN International, and we have pages of stats on the role of women in these spaces and why they matter. But then we saw when the COP29 presidency come in, where for the COP coming up this year in Azerbaijan,
mhm.
when they first put out their team, there was not one woman on it, not a
Yeah.
single woman on it. And so you're asking, what do we do about it? So a lot of the groups that I'm in coalition with, certainly our organization and many others, basically sent a letter and protested and say, no, you can't go forward with an all male presidency. And they changed it and they brought in a cohort of women to join them. So I think it's a lot about advocacy and pushing back and demonstrating why women are important to be in decision making spaces on climate.
Okay. Fantastic. And you published a book at the start of this year called "The Stories in Our Bones: How Worldviews and Climate Justice Can Remake a World in Crisis." Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, it was really enjoyable to do. I will start there. And
Good.
one of the things that I was looking at, over the years now, having been engaged in very practical ways from the climate talks where we go every year and bring delegations, we do reforestation work, we do forest protection work, we work with a lot of frontline communities to stop harmful projects around fossil fuel extraction in their communities. And we work in many different arenas. We do campaigns for banks to divest out of fossil fuels and move their financing into renewable energy. So there's these very practical pieces of work that we do every day at WeCan, which I love and have been doing for over a decade. However, I wanted to look in this book upstream and have a deeper dive into what are the root causes of the climate crisis? What are the root causes of these systems that we live in that are so detrimental? And to name them explicitly when we're looking at colonization capitalism, racism, patriarchy. They all fit together in these systems of oppression that are causing us to have this massive environmental degradation, species extinction, economic problems, obviously the climate crisis that we've been talking about. And so I wanted to look at this because I can see that even if we save one forest, another forest can be destroyed. Or, even if we could wave a magical wand and tomorrow the climate crisis was over, there'd still be overconsumerism, an economic structure that doesn't respond to the planetary boundaries, doesn't respect the planetary boundaries, and we still would have environmental racism. We would still have these problems. So for me, it's like going upstream and saying, okay, what are the root causes and how do we address them and how do we address society at a deeper level? And so the book goes into a deep dive about these root causes, but also in that process, what are different worldviews that we can have that create a sustainable and healthy and equitable future for our children and for the earth? Like, how do we actually get our minds wrapped around a different worldview that doesn't see humans dominating over nature, or, to put it bluntly, white people having white supremacy over everyone else? How do we actually dismantle these harmful structures that nobody likes and is only serving a small, wealthy elite?
Okay. Now, how do we do that?
Well, first of all, we got to get educated. I'm getting educated. I wrote the book to learn things. I learned a lot from writing the book, and the book is really a roadmap to this conversation. There's no neat and tidy answers. It's a journey of looking at where we are as a society, where these ideas came from, and how do we dismantle them and transform them into something else? Because a lot of these systems that we're in have to be composted and transformed because they're very dangerous, as we can see from what's happening from, what many scholars are calling a polycrisis all over the world. So what
Mm,
we're doing isn't working. And like, how do we do it? I think the first step is to map out what are the root causes and how do we get here? Because it's sort of like when you go to the doctor and you're not well, they can't just start prescribing stuff. What's the answer? You have to go through a whole system of analyzing and detecting what is wrong and having a diagnosis. And then from that root place of understanding the imbalance or the illness, when you have that diagnosis, you can then start to heal. So I think that's the stage we're in, where we haven't even been able to name these problems and people face up to them. And once we do, that begins the healing process.
okay. I mean, there's going to be a lot of pushback because these white people in power that you're talking about, they're not going to want to give up.
No, we don't. And I don't expect that they will necessarily. But I kind of like to think about it like maybe a good analogy would be like probiotics. If your gut is really out of balance, if you start taking a lot of probiotics, you kind of crowd out all the other things that are not good for your system by putting in good things into the system. So I think there's a lot to be said about certainly confronting the powers that be. They're not going to roll over, as you say, and just say, great, that's a great idea, we'll go out of business now. You take it from here. I don't expect that. But we do confront governments and we do confront financial institutions. And I do think there's room for direct interaction. And I do believe in interventions. So I think it's an ecosystem of things that need to happen. So, as an example, we do have campaigns where we meet directly with major banks all over the world and bring frontline leaders to talk about what's happening in the Amazon rainforest, what's happening to their communities because of fossil fuel extraction and the cancer and the illnesses that come from fossil fuel extraction in their communities. And it does have an impact. And we have had some major divestments of banks moving money out of dangerous fossil fuel projects, having heard from frontline communities about the impact. So I think there's a lot more human exchange that we need to have, and putting a human face on the harms and getting people in power to understand that maybe you are safe and your family is safe right now, but not everybody is. And these are real people and they have children and they have homes and they have a life, and really creating that exchange between people. I think that's one part of the ecosystem that we need to improve on, is getting out of silos and communicating with each other. So that's some of the work that I think is really important, is actually having direct interventions and campaigns and taking on the fight.
Mm,
But on the other hand, at WECAN, we also believe in also demonstrating solutions. And sort of like Bucky Fuller has always stated, build the system you want and people will become a part of that because it's just simply better. So there's a lot of work we do around food sovereignty and food security and reforestation, and it's incredibly exciting work. Just to give one example, because I was just getting off a call earlier this evening with our partners in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where we've
Hmm.
been reforesting for 8 years now. And this is in the Tombe region in the eastern DR Congo. And maybe your listeners know, but second to the Amazon rainforest is the Congo Basin in terms of importance, in terms of carbon sequestration and mitigating the worst of the climate crisis. That's of course the boreal forest and the Indonesian forest, but the Congo Basin is also very key. And in the Tombe rainforest, there's been a lot of slash and burn and like total devastation to the land. I mean, some areas I looked at, there's not even any green left. It's just like a field with no green. And so after 8 years of reforestation, 25% of the trees we've grown go back for the communities to use for human use, and 75% of the trees we grow for reforestation, rewilding. And what's happened now, and I didn't think it would happen this quickly, which really surprised me, is that now a lot of the communities don't need to use the old growth forests, which is great. That was the whole point, is that they would
Sure.
use the trees that we grew. So now
Hmm.
we're protecting 1.6 million acres of old growth forest. We're almost there where we're not using any of it anymore. We're still using some, but it's getting to that point. So there's like incredible carbon sequestration in this one area of over 1.6 million acres that's being protected. And then what is amazing just last year is that because of all the trees that we've grown, it's bringing in moisture and the trees are seeding rain. And so there's a lot more moisture, a lot more rain, and the forest is now starting to rewild itself. And so
Wow.
even though we're having our nurseries and we're planting trees, the forest itself is now, nature is taking over in vast areas to rewild herself. And I just find that really exciting to see how fast this regeneration happened. And of course, there's lots more to go and we have a lot more work to do, but it just speaks a lot to when we decide to be life enhancing species versus extracting and taking from the earth, what a role that we can play that's super positive as we interact with the earth in a different way.
Okay. And so this is, you said it's a 25-75 split. So the people there are using 25% of the forest for their own use for whatever they need the wood for. And then the 75 is left to grow itself. Is that a model that you think can be kind of copy and pasted into other regions that are having similar issues? Or,
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's something that we designed sort of out of, just experience and navigating on our own, feeling our way forward. But I definitely think it's something that's replicable. Absolutely.
fantastic. And I know that you have a strong opinion on the rights of nature as well as a topic. Can you explain to people who might be unfamiliar with the idea of what that is and why it's important?
Sure. So, rights of nature is the idea, but also a practice legally of giving or recognizing, I should say, that nature has rights. So, in the same way that human beings have rights, and we have the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Humans, we're saying that, in our current legal frameworks, we can't just see nature as property. It's been very detrimental, and our environmental laws are not really effective in the way that we need them to be, or we wouldn't be in an ecological and a climate crisis. If these laws were working, the
Sure.
environment would be protected.
Mm.
So, yes, environmental laws have helped protect some of nature and some of our natural systems. But most of those laws are regulatory laws, which means they regulate how much harm can happen. They don't really protect nature, they regulate harm. And of course, corporations get very involved in those laws and water them down and tweak them to their favor. So that's very problematic. And this idea of rights of nature is saying that nature, forests, rivers, these ecosystems have the right to be healthy and thrive just like a human being. And we need to lift up those rights. And when they have rights, a forest has rights or a river has rights, they can be presented independently in a court of law. Because right now, you can't really protect any ecosystem. It has to be under the ownership of a human being.
Right.
So it's really turning environmental law upside down and inside out and saying, no, let's put Mother Earth, nature, right in the center of the conversation. And it's not just a theory of legal practice, it's actually something that's being implemented right now. In 2008, Ecuador became the first country in the world to put rights of nature into their constitution. And there have been several rivers in Ecuador that have been protected now under rights of nature legislation. In the United States, here, there's over 3 dozen cases at the local level in communities that have now rights of nature ordinances protecting communities from fossil fuel extraction and other kinds of harms. We see in Colombia, there have been rights of nature laws to protect the Amazon rainforest. I was just reading today that there was a river, I think I might be mistaken, but I think even in Spain. You'll have to check it out because it just
Okay.
went by my screen really quickly, but it's new. I think it just happened very recently. So since you're in Spain, I think you might be able to find that. And then I just mentioned one more as the Wanganui River in New Zealand was given personhood. It was a fight over 100 years by the Maori people to protect the Wanganui River, which they view as a living relative, as their ancestor. And now they have a settlement with the government where there's someone from the Maori people and the government who steward and caretake are the custodians rather of this Wanganui River. And it's this again, since we've been talking about worldview, which is what my book is about, is like how do we have this worldview of an animate living earth?
Hmm.
And they see the rivers as, their relatives, as sisters, as part of their family relationship. And I think this is really healthy. And one of the things I think that rights of nature can do is not only change our legal frameworks and how we look at nature, but also it can start changing culturally how we understand our relationship to nature and seeing nature as a living being, which the web of life is. And how do we really reclaim and regenerate something all of our ancestors had in ancient times of this understanding that we are part and particle of nature and that we're part of an animate cosmology. And I think we really need to reclaim this and understand this. And it's also why it's so important to lift up not just women, but we also work a lot with Indigenous peoples because of their worldview and understanding of the living web of life. And how do we really honor Indigenous peoples and their understanding of nature? And to recognize that 80% of all the biodiversity left on Earth, 80% is in the lands and hands of Indigenous peoples. And there's a reason for that, which is their worldview and their understanding of our right relationship and harmony with nature. And that also ties into this whole rights of nature movement, which many Indigenous peoples are engaged in. And a lot of the seed ideas originate from original instructions of Indigenous peoples.
Yeah. 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 I had a solicitor on the podcast last year, Jojo Mehta, who's based out of the UK, and she's working to try and make ecocide as a crime recognized by the International Court of Justice, which would be a huge, huge step. It has already been recognized as a crime in Europe, but not by the ICJ, the International Court of Justice. But they're working towards it. Is that something as well that you would get on board with? You would see it as part and parcel of the rights of nature?
Yes, and we've partnered a lot with ecocide campaigns and with ecocide leaders, and they're in the same sort of umbrella of work. I would
Hmm.
say, they're related. They're not exactly the same, but they're in the same idea of putting nature into the center of the conversation and ensuring that there's laws to protect the web of life. And so it's another sort of stream of thought along with rights of nature. It's connected for sure.
Okay. And you also talk about language use and world views. So, can, again, for people who are unfamiliar with your views on that, give us a quick 101 on why that's important?
So I really enjoyed this is some of the chapters at the end of my book, The Stories in Our Bones, is, unpacking a lot of things that we've discussed already, but then taking it sort of on a more personal level, looking at actually our language and how our language affects how we think. So here's an example. We often, all of us use the term resources when we're
Mm.
talking about, the Wanganui River or the Amazon River or the forest versus talking about the boreal forest or the intricacies of the Tombe rainforest where we're working in the DR Congo. And these are all just resources. What are we doing with these resources? And just saying that word immediately reduces the river or the mountain or the forest or the ocean to a language of a mercantile language a language of extraction, a language of the commodification and financialization of nature. We're no longer looking at the web of life. We're no longer looking at an actual river by name or a forest, the redwood trees or the bristlecone pine trees. We're no longer talking about a living being. We're talking about board feet. We're talking about what we can gain financially from that resource. So that's just one example of how language can affect how we view the world. And so I think this is something that we need to look at. And I was with a colleague some years ago in Prague, a Czechish friend, and he was sharing with me some of the old Czechish language around the names of the months of the year. And
Oh,
why I was really intrigued by this is because each month actually was related to what nature's doing, like the month of ice or, blossoms blooming month. And these names that actually tell you what nature's doing that month and how that affects our mind and our presence with the earth simply by naming what's going on versus, in English, we say January, February, March, which I know in the back of my mind, it goes back to some Greek goddesses or gods, but I don't know which ones. It doesn't really mean anything that impacts me directly.
sure.
But if I think about this is the month of ice, it's in the middle of winter, it just changes again that relationship with nature. So what I'm really getting at with worldview here and our language and the way we think is how do we rejuvenate this understanding that nature is alive? Because when we understand something's alive and we build a relationship, we care for it. It's very hard to care for something you don't know, you don't love, you don't have a relationship with. So
Mm,
it's how to really revitalize a relational language. And that's really what I'm getting at with that point.
that's interesting. Yeah. I mean, language use and changing language use can absolutely have an impact on how people view things. That's an obvious one, but it's not one that I guess people might have considered, particularly in the climate fight and the struggle to protect nature. Fascinating. We are coming towards the end of the podcast now, Osprey. Is there any question that I haven't asked that you wish I had, or any aspect of this we haven't touched on that you think it's important for people to think about?
I think I'll just mention one other thing that because you have a climate audience, I just want to mention one other thing.
Sure.
I sit on the steering committee of something called the Fossil Fuel Nonproliferation Treaty.
Oh, yeah.
And I think it's really important in regard to rights of nature. That's one portion of work legal. I think that's really important. But also this fossil fuel nonproliferation treaty, I think it's very important because we all fought for the Paris Climate Agreement. It definitely has loopholes and giant problems. One of the biggest being that it doesn't really deal with the supply end of the problem. It deals with
Purposely.
carbon emission reductions,
Yeah.
which means the fossil fuel companies just can continue carrying on business as usual, which is a disaster. And what I love about the Fossil Fuel Nonproliferation Treaty is it's a mechanism that doesn't substitute the Paris Climate Agreement. It can be developed side by side with the Paris Climate Agreement. And it really pushes forward the fact of how are countries really going to get off of fossil fuels, stop fossil fuel production. And I think it's a very exciting initiative, and I've been engaged in it for several years. And now 12 countries have endorsed the Fossil Fuel Nonproliferation Treaty. And when we were at COP28 in Dubai, it was very significant that Colombia signed on to the treaty because they're a
Mm,
fossil fuel producing country. So it
yeah.
shows that even a country producing fossil fuels can get behind this idea. And I think it's really significant and something we should all be tracking.
And how do I, or anyone listening as an individual, convince my government or the government of the country I'm living in that they should also sign up to the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty?
Well, I think that one of the most straightforward ways is that we do know that governments, even though it was very weak, agreed at COP28 to move off of fossil fuels. It was stated
Yep.
weakly as ever, but it was said. So, like, this moment is coming, and the faster we do it, the more we're going to spare ourselves from harm. And it's economically intelligent to get off of fossil fuels as soon as possible. The renewables are there and my goodness, everyone's spending gazillions of dollars on climate disaster
Yeah.
relief. And it's just an obvious thing to do. The problem is we have got to have government stand up to the fossil fuel industry. And until that happens, we're not in good shape. And
Mhm.
so this treaty can help people sort of get their minds wrapped around a mechanism to do it.
Okay. Okay. I'm on another screen here. I track the amount of fossil fuel free energy that is being created on the Spanish grid daily. And it turns out that today it's going to be 88% of the electricity on the Spanish grid will be created from fossil fuel free sources. So it's that's nice to watch. And
Yeah.
it's regularly well north of 70%, which is always nice to see. And 88 is pretty good, but it was 87 yesterday and 86 the day before, so it's not unusually high at 88. I prefer to see it at 100, and we'll get there because it's going in the right direction. All these things take time, unfortunately.
Which we don't have a lot of.
No, no, we don't. We don't. Osprey,
But
that's
we're going to
been
keep going and, never give up. That's what I say. Never give up.
very good. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Osprey, if people would like to know more about yourself or any of the things we discussed on the podcast today, where would you have me direct them?
Thanks for asking. People are welcome to come to our website at WECAN, WCAN, and then the whole word international spelt out .org. So wecaninternational.org. And all of our programs and projects are there. And yeah, thanks so much for asking.
Not at all. Osprey, that's been really, really interesting. Thanks a million for coming on the podcast today.
Thanks so much for having me. Really fun to speak with you. Thanks so much.